Please welcome to the stage National Renewable Energy Laboratory Associate Director of Energy, Policy and Analysis, and CU Boulder Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute Fellow, Jeff Logan.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone here who's here in the room. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the case may be. And welcome to our panel on adaptation, mitigation, and disaster response. My name is Jeff Logan, and today I'm representing the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute at the University of Colorado in Boulder. But I also spend a lot of my time at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, known as NREL. And NREL is one of 17 Department of Energy national laboratories, and the only one that focuses exclusively on sustainability and clean energy. And we're going to hear a lot more, I think, about NREL later in today's panel. Before I talk about some of the subjects that the panel is going to deal with, I wanted to offer some personal thanks to a few people. First, the three co-chairs who largely spent the past year putting together these panels and keynote talks deserve our thanks. And that includes Heidi Van Genderen, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer here at CU Boulder, James Anaya, who's in the law school and a renowned human rights lawyer, and finally, Seth Marder, who's the director of the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute. They all deserve our great thanks. Second, John Leslie and his team in the Strategic Relations and Communications office here at CU Boulder have worked tirelessly on the logistics and the operational challenges associated with bringing these many people together. And so I wanted to offer special thanks to them as well. Finally, and last but not least, our panelists and moderator, both in person and joining us virtually as well. So today's panel is going to focus on what we can do to make sure that the most vulnerable people are not ignored in our fight to address the climate crisis. There are profound questions and trade-offs surrounding mitigation, adaptation, and disaster response that will need to be addressed as the climate crisis continues to unfold. Our moderator and panelists will try to focus on solutions that we can all strive to implement. And before I introduce the moderator, I just wanted to say a couple words about RACE, the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute. RACE is a joint institute between CU Boulder and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that advances research on sustainability and clean energy. I have been affiliated with RACE for about 4 years, and I've been aware of RACE for about 10. And Seth Marder joined about 18 months ago as the new director, and I have never seen the institute more vibrant, impactful, and dedicated to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So I want to thank Seth for bringing that energy and vision to the institute and to the campus. We're fortunate to have David Abel as our moderator today. David is an award-winning reporter, documentary filmmaker, and professor of journalism who covers environmental issues, mainly focused on climate change for the Boston Globe. Abel's work has won an Edward R. Murrow Award, the Ernie Pyle Award from the Scripps Howard Foundation, and Sigma Delta Chi Awards for climate reporting and feature reporting. He was also part of the team that won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting for the paper's coverage of the Boston Marathon bombings. Over the years, he has written stories that cast light on serious problems in Massachusetts, such as the failures of the state to enforce its environmental laws, state prisons that fail to supply water that meets federal safety standards, and the damage caused by major cuts to environmental agencies. As a documentarian, Abel has directed several films, including Entangled, which chronicles the efforts to protect North Atlantic right whales from extinction amid climate change, and Lobster War, the fight over the world's richest fishing grounds, detailing a climate-fueled conflict between the United States and Canada over waters that both countries have claimed since the end of the Revolutionary War. Entangled won a Jackson Wild Award, known as the Oscars of nature films, and he was nominated for a National Emmy. Abel helped launch the podcast Climate Rising, produced by Harvard Business School in 2019. The podcast still runs today. He is now a professor of science journalism in the College of Communication at Boston College. And, and I want to ask now that we queue up a short outtake from a movie that David is currently producing and directing, and I think this short snippet will give us a nice framing for what the discussion will look like this morning. So can we cue up the movie, please?
News alert, it's getting hotter. Boston will be underwater. News alert, it's getting hotter. Boston will be underwater.
Today, we are going to be going into the Seaport District of Boston. And it doesn't take a genius to look at that at sea level and tell that we shouldn't be building buildings there with climate change on the way. The state of Massachusetts has invested $20 billion in the Seaport District. In the next 10 years, if a nor'easter hit the Seaport District, it would cause over $1 billion of damage. And who do you think is going to pay for that damage?
We are.
We are. Today, we will shatter that climate silence. And every single person in the Seaport District is going to hear us.
The Seaport is unique because it didn't exist. At one point it was water. It's also an interesting case because it's a brand new neighborhood.
The changes that have taken place and the permissions that have been given for people to build in the coastal zone and around the water's edge without taking in consideration the long-term impacts is of real concern to me.
There was no attention paid to sea level rise.
We had developers come in, build buildings, and then get out 5 years later.
This place is going to be subject to devastation, and the building continues.
So as we keep increasing the carbon dioxide concentrations of the atmosphere, we're worried that we could be approaching some tipping points in the climate system that could trigger some really pretty extreme events. If sea level comes from a big loss of the Antarctic ice sheet, Boston will feel 25% more sea level rise than the global average.
The seaport, in fact, the whole city, one of the world's most vulnerable areas to sea level rise and coastal flooding.
80 years from now, a lot of the seaport is just going to be underwater, not just during high tides or extreme high tides or during storms, but all the time.
We plan to own this area for a very long time. It's important to us to design for the future.
And so it's a terrific responsibility for us to make sure that we're thinking about not only our generation, but future generations, and that we're thinking about the future of the city.
Coastal flooding, sea level rise really wasn't on anyone's radar. The city wanted to unlock its potential. We need housing, we need jobs, and the framers of the city saw an opportunity.
It's too complex to say whether or not it was a mistake to build the seaport as we did. If we knew everything that we know now a dozen years ago, we could have been asking more
So now the seaport area is bustling. Major companies are based there.
At some point, the seaport will no longer be viable. The sea level will be too high unless they want to literally wall themselves in.
If we can't get ourselves together to prevent 6-7 feet of sea level rise, I'm not sure that we're a society that deserves to survive.
Innovation district, there's no chance that innovation is going to outlast inundation in the seaport. This is going underwater. This is the inundation district.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I just thought I would take a few minutes to start by putting this conversation in a bit of context, so bear with me a little bit. Some of you guys might be familiar with some of this, but last year, as many of you know, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, called climate change a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening, he wrote. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. More recently, he described the world as, quote, sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. And he called our addiction to fossil fuels madness, which he said is leading us toward mutually assured destruction. I just want to take a few minutes to note why the Secretary General's words are not hyperbole. Today, we live on a planet with about a third more carbon in the atmosphere than at any point in the last 800,000 years, depending on the estimates, and it might go back as long as 15 million years. Since the first climate summit in Rio 30 years ago, human beings, and I'm talking about those primarily here in the United States, have pumped as much carbon into the atmosphere as we did in the previous 30,000 years. At the time of the Rio summit, fossil fuels provided roughly 80% of the world's energy. Today, fossil fuels still provide roughly the same amount, but global energy use has surged since then by nearly 2/3. All the carbon we've been putting into the atmosphere, as many of you know, has put our planet on a path to between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. Those numbers are often repeated and sometimes can seem abstract, but I just want to set the table here for what we're really talking about. At 2 degrees of warming, the world's major ice sheets are likely to collapse. Some 400 million people will suffer from water scarcity. Major cities along the equator will become too hot or humid to live in, and heat waves will kill thousands of people every summer, even in northern latitudes. At 3 degrees, extreme droughts will become permanent throughout large parts of the world. Areas burned by wildfires just here in the United States will be 6 times larger than they are today. Hunger will increase, crops will fail, rising seas will flood coastal cities, storms will become far more destructive, conflicts over resources will likely, sadly, lead to more wars, and as many as 1 million species could go extinct. And ultimately, what this all leads to is that more people are likely to die. The reason I am rehearsing these facts is because those most affected by the consequences of climate change, unfortunately, are the most vulnerable. Those who had the least to do with causing climate change. The medical journal The Lancet recently issued a report that found heat-related deaths among the world's vulnerable populations increased by about 68% between 2020 and 2021. It also found that heat exposure last year led to billions of hours of lost wages for the most vulnerable, and that extreme weather events just last year, caused damage worth more than $250 billion. The largest burden, the report noted, of course, has and will fall on the global south, where none of the losses in just the past year were insured, or next to none. I'm sharing this because I want to underscore the threats facing indigenous peoples, refugees, women, children, the elderly, the disabled, those living on island nations, those living in the Arctic, in short, the most vulnerable among us. The threats they are facing are existential. And it's clear that we need to do more to help, especially those of us lucky enough to live in the richest country in the world, which is also the greatest source for all of the emissions and many of the threats facing the planet. So, joining me this morning to discuss what we can do to help the most vulnerable and how we might head off the worst consequences of climate change are Martin Keller, Constance Okolet, Elizabeth Robinson, and Roberto Sanchez Rodriguez. And I'm now going to introduce our panelists. Martin Keller is director of the National Renewable Energy Lab and president of the Alliance for Sustainable Energy, which is the company that operates the National Lab for the US Department of Energy. Martin previously led a range of research programs at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Martin, please take the stage. You can give him a round of applause, please. Constance Okolet, who will be joining us virtually, is chair of the Osukuru United Women's Network in eastern Uganda. A self-described peasant farmer and mother of 7, Constance leads a consortium of about 1,200 small women's groups who work on education, community health, and nutrition. Hopefully she will appear virtually. Round of applause, please. Thank you. Elizabeth Robinson is director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. An environmental economist, Liz has more than 30 years of research experience, particularly in low-income countries. Her research focuses on policies to reduce emissions and improve the livelihoods of resource-dependent communities. Liz also leads a working group of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. Please welcome Liz. And finally, we will be joined virtually by Roberto Sanchez Rodriguez. He is a professor of the department, a professor in the Department of Urban and Environmental Studies of El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, a research institute of Mexico's National Council of Science and Technology. Roberto serves as vice chair of a working group of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's also a member of the Joint Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Program. His research has focused on climate change, including vulnerability, risk, adaptation, and much more. So please welcome Roberto. Okay. All right. So a few weeks ago, the United Nations released a report that found no credible way for the world to reduce emissions below what has long been considered the critical threshold of 1.5 degrees. The report described national commitments as pitifully short of reaching that goal. the likelihood is that average global temperatures will exceed that threshold by the end of this decade, and without serious action, exceed 2.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. That, of course, would be catastrophic and threaten the lives of billions of people. So I would like to start off with this question for each panelist to offer what you guys think are the actions that can and should be taken to reduce vulnerability, particularly in countries that are most affected. And Liz, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks. I think I'll start off just by saying that as you showed in your film and as you gave in your talk, we have to really continue to focus on mitigation because there are limits to adaptation and we will breach those limits at 2 and 2.5 degrees. But because today is a solutions day, I thought I'd just give 3 examples of how adaptation does work, and it's not normally that complicated, but we really have to focus on who matters. So in France, 15,000 people died in a heat wave in 2003. In 2019, 1,500 people died, so it's an order of magnitude 10 less. It was a worse heat wave, but France figured out how to adapt. First of all, it focused on the most vulnerable, who were those with pre-existing conditions and the elderly, and they introduced something very simple, an early warning system where someone pings you on your phone, cooling stations in hospitals and cooling stations in old people's homes. But of course, the most vulnerable still weren't reached if you don't have a phone, if you live on the street, if you're homeless, if you can't reach those places. But they did show adaptation works. Second example is Bangladesh and adapting to floods. And if we go back sort of 30, 40 years, Bangladesh took a very technocratic approach to adaptation. So you had central planning and you looked at where the water was going, and basically you build embankments and you tell the water it's going to go in this way. And it made me think about your Boston film, this idea that we just have to build embankments. But what happened was flooding got worse and people were more harmed because there was increased sedimentation, there was subsidence of land, and people had a sort of false sense of security that the embankments would protect them. So fast forward to the 2000s, and a totally different approach to adaptation, which is not going to surprise people in this room because we're all here because we sort of have a shared understanding. First of all, people were brought into the equation for the first time. So local communities were talked with. Secondly, and consulted and brought in as actual stakeholders. Secondly, there was a move not to battle nature, but to work with nature. And so I think we see this across the world. We see this in the UK now, using more floodplains, for example, and accepting that flooding will happen and working with it. So that's the second example. The third example is in Nigeria, where I'm working with health professionals there, and we look at who are the most vulnerable workers. And you gave some of those statistics that labor is going to be harmed, labor supply is going to be harmed. And if your labor supply is harmed, you lose your livelihood. And some of the most vulnerable workers are outdoor workers, construction workers, and agricultural workers. And so in some ways, it's clear what we need. It's cooling, it's refreshment breaks, and it might be not working in the heat of the midday sun. But if we look at women, for example, because this is very gendered, it turns out, it's not enough to give women an opportunity to rest and have water, because women need somewhere to go to the toilet. I don't know any of us, but my personal experience is doing field work. You don't drink all day because you're worried that there'll be nowhere to go to the toilet. So it's some of these subtle aspects. We also don't know the health impacts of heat. We know some of them, but we've only recently learned that agricultural workers are particularly at risk of kidney disease with the combination of dehydration and heat. And so there are just 3 examples to say it is possible to adapt, but my mantra is always, first of all, we need to mitigate because we will breach limits.
Great.
Thank you.
Martin?
Yeah, look, for me as a technologist, I fully agree with everything what you said, but I think it's also important, how do we accelerate the energy transition across all the nations? And look, this is where I think we also probably talk about this a little bit later on, where the question of energy justice, environmental justice would be a major, major player. What can the more developed countries do to really help all the countries, all communities to help in this energy transition? And this will be a major, major task. When you see what's ahead of us, sometimes even when you look at the current technology we have, I think it's very kind of scary to see what we need to do in the next 10, 15, 20 years to really set the energy transition in motion. I also have to say this where, and I don't know if everybody agrees with this, but look, there is a little bit sometimes, especially let's say here in the United States, is where we know we have to do the energy transition, but a lot of times people really don't want to build new things. we're getting into this point where people are worried, well, yeah, it's not in my backyard. I don't want to see solar panels on my neighbor's rooftop. I don't want to see a wind turbine in the distance. This said, we also always still enjoying the energy in our daily lives. So I think we have to see how do we make this happening, that we doing a just energy transition where we have the ability to bring everybody around, because we need adaptation, absolutely, but we also need to accelerate the energy transition, and we have to do it much, much faster. We always bring this example. It took about 30 years for solar to go from a crazy idea. Like we always have some hippies at the NREL said, oh, we want to do solar. And everybody said, what are you all talking about? It will never happen. To be now one of the cheapest way to produce electricity. So now we're having a lot of this technology. Now we have to deploy this technology and at the same time continue on the innovation, because we still don't have all the innovation and all the technologies in our hands. There is some gaps. So I think we have to start on the adaptation, but we also have to help countries to deploy the technology and accelerate this dramatically.
Great, I'd like to bring in our virtual guests. Can you guys hear us okay? Great. Constance, welcome.
Hello. Yes? Hello? Am I muted?
Sir, yes, you're unmuted, and we would love to hear your answer to the question.
All right. This is very serious because I'm a farmer, and being a farmer who produces food for the whole world, it looks like everything is going to be flat. By me saying flat, that it means that everybody is not going to be there, and everything must not be there at all, because here we are farmers, we need the rain, there is no rain, we need the water, there's a lot of water that comes and floods the area, we need services, there are no services. You find that everything is no longer there as it used to be. So with the farmers, we need a lot of programs that can help us. We need a lot of indigenous knowledge that we used to have. These days, the indigenous knowledge is no longer there. And we need all those knowledge and put together, join with the science. For us, we don't know the new technology. We don't know water technologies. For us, we know today is this, tomorrow is that. We don't know the percentage, but we know that this one today is very high, the other one is very low. For us, we don't know that what about tomorrow? How is it going to be? We know that when these birds are flowing this ends, from this end to this end, it is like going to rain. When the floods are coming, we know that the floods are coming because of maybe the frogs making a lot of noise in there. We know that there is floods coming. So we prepare for those events. But with climate change now, the increase in pollution, the increase in the percentage, we are going to be no longer there. Plus the next generation not there, everybody not there, everything not there.
Thank you, Constance. Roberto?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Yes, this is a very interesting question. And let me go back to your initial statement, David. And we are in a critical situation. And two of our fellow panelists highlighted the importance of mitigation. And I completely agree. I mean, every degree in global warming will reduce opportunities for adaptation and will increase its costs. So mitigation is no doubt an important element of the response. However, adaptation has been neglected too much. It's already very late to adapt in many parts of the country, in many parts of the world. let's remember that this 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade average of global warming has different regional manifestations. As we of course know that the poles are warmer than the average, but also the dry lands, the area where most of the developing countries are located, the tropics, are areas that have already increased their temperature. So for me, it's critical that we begin to adapt as soon as possible. Now, when we talk about this, we certainly need to recognize that this part of the world that we are discussing is that we live in a world that is very heterogeneous. First of all, countries that are fragile, big parts of the world, countries that are fragile, they represent 22% of the global population. These countries are prone to complex crises, armed conflicts, sociopolitical fragility that increases vulnerability to climate change. These developing countries have also weak institutions, gaps in human, economic, and technical resources that impact efficient decision-making. Weak inclusive governance and institutions and development agendas do not respond to climate change. So what we need to do is not only focus on financing in terms of providing assistance for adaptation, but we also need to invest in reducing development gaps in many of these countries to strengthen their institutions, to really create the capacity to respond to climate change in terms of adaptation and reducing vulnerability. And part of the big question is, but one of the big challenges is that not enough has been done in terms of really making these countries aware about the situation they're facing. Many of these countries don't discuss climate change. Many of these countries still lack any real opportunity to reduce vulnerability and adapt to climate change.
Gracias, Roberto. COP27 was supposed to bring greater commitments for increased carbon emissions. Unfortunately, that doesn't appear to have happened. Last year, global emissions actually increased by 6% to record levels. And unfortunately, they're expected to rise anywhere between 10 and 16% over 2010 levels by the end of this decade. Again, this is a question for each panelist. What do you think are the potential human rights implications for missing or failing to reduce emissions, and what more should we be doing to press for cuts as soon as possible? And I will start off with Constance.
Actually, it's so serious because when there's an increase instead of decrease, it means that the whole world is going to be covered. How can I say it? It is going to be covered. Nobody's going to live. There's going to be death by everybody, including the major polluters, because they're living people like everybody, like us. And there's going to be, since we already have so many sicknesses, we already have so many deaths, but now we are going to add more deaths on top of the deaths. Now, where are we going? And what are we doing? And what is everybody thinking about that? And everybody's looking at that. So I see that we need to talk, sit, and have a round table with those polluters so that they can reduce the emission. They can reduce up to a certain level. They can see that things are not at, how can I say it? It is not good because like we are talking, they are not listening. We are telling them, they are not seeing, but for us, we are seeing the whole impact of climate change. It's on us, and we are the ones eating it and dying. Now, we need a roundtable talk. 2, we continue talking. We shouldn't stop telling them because everybody must listen to each other and we all need each other. We should work together. And also, we need them to come up with a strategy of giving money directly to the people who are now eating who are now suffering at grassroots, so that they can help put in some strategies, help them put in some strategies so that at least we can live, and then the next generation can come, and then the life will continue as from us, the ancestors, then we came in, then other people, we all die, other people come in, like that, like that, like that. But without it, the world is going to be off completely.
Constance, I just want to ask you a follow-up question. You're speaking to a really sympathetic audience here, but what message would you want to share with Americans who, again, are the largest historic source of carbon emissions by an incredible amount? What message would you want to share with Americans about why it's our responsibility to do more and to do a disproportionate share of reducing our emissions?
I as Constance, I say that let them help us. Let them not increase the emission. Let them reduce the emission up to the minimum standards. Because with the high emission, things won't work for us. We are farmers. We don't have the seasons. We don't have the fruits. We don't have the food. We don't have the water, clean water. We have nothing. And yet we work a lot. In the gardens, we have to bring the food, more so the women. We have to bring the food on table. Children must go to school. Everybody must be alive, because the little food that we bring out is the food that helps everybody, that serves everybody, and serves the whole world also. But now I would tell them, let me tell them that let them help us and reduce the emission. 2, let them have that money that they have to give to us. Let them send that money to the people so that the people can now help in, maybe like for tree planting, it will reduce. More activities, that is for like to change the climate, it will help us. Let them also come and see and test what we are going through, because like they are seated, they on a swinging, they call it a swinging chair. They just stand like this and get what they want. They use the card to eat. They use the card to drink water. And for us, if we don't bite it with our teeth, we don't get anything. It's real suffering, real suffering. Let them think that everybody moves with blood and everybody needs each other. So we need them, they also need us. Without us, they are also, we may be without them. So let them come, let them reduce the emission, let them give the money directly to the communities that we are helping to stand with the situation that is going on now. Though most people don't understand the meaning of climate change because they had never seen it before. So I think,
Thank you, thank you. Roberto, the same questions for you, and also if you could address the follow-up question.
Sure. Well, clearly we haven't done enough to address the issue of climate change. And let me refer this in terms of in terms of the impact on human rights of the lack of action. Let me go back to President Robinson's presentation yesterday, plenary presentation. And she spoke about 5 injustices. We focus on climate justice right now, but she also talked about gender and social injustice, intergenerational injustice, different paths of development in different parts of the world on justice and nature and justice. Now, altogether, they really created more comprehensive perspective of what the implications on human rights are of the lack of action to really address the issue of climate change in its proper dimension. And I believe that part of the problem is that we have done a very poor job in actually forecasting the future, what all this injustice represents for the world. From international migration, that people that the only way to adapt to the climate crisis, together with a number of other issues, is to migrate. I mean, despite the costs and lives and despair in destruction of families and communities, etc. I believe that without a comprehensive perspective of what are the implications of climate change, we will still damage significantly human rights throughout the world.
Martin?
Yeah, I tell you, this is, for me as a scientist and engineer, I don't want to talk about politics because that's not what we do. So, but I just want to bring this to a point to see how do we actually make it happen. And I tell you that one of the big problems in my view is that when I just focus here on the US, you said it very well. I think we have a responsibility to really move very fast in decreasing our emissions. So that's a given. So the question then is, how do you do that? And so you can see, and when we all see, I just came back from COP not long ago, and I tell you sometimes, very honestly, it's frustrating. There's a lot of talk. But what is the action? What can you do? How can you move this energy transition faster into the communities? And I think this is where, in our view, is where we need to go into the communities. And what we started at NREL and also now with the Department of Energy under the Biden administration is really to focus on this. How can you help to create this kind of plans for communities to make this transition happen? Because when you do, again, I'll talk about the US, whatever you decide in Washington, if it's not bought in within the communities, I think the energy transition will not happen. So how do you reach these communities? How do you help them to give them the tools to lay out the plan for this energy transition? Because it's clearly when we lay this out, what we need to do in 10, 15 years, because I said that's a very daunting task. So we, as researchers, have to help the communities to see, look, this is your deployment, this is your plan, how you can make this energy transition happen. If we are successful to reach and bring this into the communities, and the communities are the driver of the change, then it's very hard for other politicians to revert this decision. Now, on a global scale, what we also launched, what it's called Net Zero World, the same concept that how can we, with our knowledge we have, help the emerging, developing countries to really help them to see what are the most important things to do, what can you do to make this happen? Because there we're seeing this where NREL, we work in 90 different countries, where a lot of these countries come to us and say, well, we want to achieve this, but help us, how do we do this? How do we achieve this transition? So I think we in the US, and I would say the same for Europe and other areas in the world, we have I think a responsibility to help them to achieve their goals and lay out a path how they can achieve this. Again, this is, look, and again, I don't want to talk about the politics, and that's not our area, so I can't not talk about this. But I think from a research, from an innovation, from a deployment perspective, we in the US have a lot of experience, and I think we need to move faster within the US, but we also bring this knowledge to other countries and help them in this transition plan.
Unfortunately, it seems like politics is what this is all about in a lot of ways, in that we have technological solutions that could actually address a lot of these issues, but we don't necessarily have the political will, and then there are political obstacles, and so finding political paths, it seems like these are the most important solutions on the table. Liz?
Yeah, so if we go back to sort of, you asked the human rights implications of these increasing emissions. And so if we ask ourselves, what does that imply? So that implies we're going to have increased air pollution, we're going to have continued destruction of our forests, and we're probably going to continue to have increasingly unhealthy diets. And if we think about children born today, their whole health outcomes are going to be defined by the extent to which we tackle climate change. And so if we start to think about the rights of the child, we can actually think right now in the UK, we're debating in Parliament the right for children to have clean air. So we're taking legislation talking about the right for children to have clean air, and that brings into stark focus, I think, the fact that if we continue to allow emissions to rise, that's harming the health of children. And this comes about because a young child in London died of an asthma attack during a very hot spell when there was a lot of air pollution. And so this is Ella Kissi-Debraj, and a lot of this work's been done in her name in the UK. And so this very much comes from her rights that she lost when she very sadly died. But there's a lot of evidence about the health impacts of climate change. And so we know that heat affects people's health and air pollution affects people's health. But now increasingly there's knowledge that heat and air pollution together are way more than double the impacts of those on their own. So if we think about the right to a healthy living, the right to grow up in a clean environment, then if we allow emissions to continue as they are because we're not following an energy transition that we need, we're denying our children those basic rights. And if we think about indigenous peoples who live in forested areas, if we don't find ways for them to be empowered to decide what happens to the forests for themselves, they're going to lose their rights because we know that those increased emissions are going to be because we are chopping down more forests for various reasons, including more land for agriculture to feed cows to increase our unhealthy diets. And children have a right to healthy diets as well, but we have a food environment which encourages much less healthy diets. I'm not sure I answered your add-on question of the politics of it. It's very frustrating. We heard that there's trillions of dollars in subsidies to fossil fuels, and about 400 billion of those are direct subsidies where governments are making a choice to give money. Another sort of billion or so are the fact that there's a cost of air pollution to poor health, and the rest of those are the externalities to climate change. So there's at least 400 billion where governments are making a choice. So the politics are very clear. A lot of it's due to lobbying. And I think to some extent, we heard this yesterday as well, unlike the climate deniers, we actually have to tell the truth. But we can tell the truth with better narratives. So we can start off with really strong data. For example, we heard earlier the number of people who are dying due to air pollution. We can start off with data about the number of people whose health is being harmed due to wildfires. Or we can craft the narratives about a better future. And if we think about low-income countries, it's hard to talk about mitigation and adaptation separately, because these are countries that need growth pathways, but they need growth pathways that are compatible with global net zero. And so adaptation and mitigation separately doesn't work so well. We really need to talk about resilient growth pathways with rapid access to energy. It's not even an energy transition, is it? These are countries, I've lived and worked in Africa for many years, and I know many people are from the African continent. There just is not enough energy. The amount of energy people use is very low. It tends to be inefficient too. And so we're looking for better pathways. And I think when we take the health angle, those health co-benefits of a 1.5 degree world and a net zero by 2050 world, it starts to take us to some of those rights aspects.
Just a quick follow-up. This summer, I think the UK, London, had some of the highest temperatures ever recorded, and maybe, I don't know if the woman you're referring to or the girl you're referring to died as a result of that or experienced asthmatic conditions. Does this new administration that just took power, are they making any policy changes that might make a meaningful difference than the Boris Johnson administration?
Yeah, we sometimes lose track of which administration we're on.
Yeah.
But,
is it the lettuce, the head of lettuce that's
lettuce is
in
going
power
strong,
now?
I think. To some extent, there's some small positives. So at last, after 12 years of our government not investing in insulation, which makes people warmer and healthier, reduces people's bills and makes them better off, and reduces emissions, so a win-win-win scenario. We're at last tackling the most obvious thing one can do in the UK. We're at last accepting onshore wind, which is, again, the most obvious thing you can do in the UK. There's still issues as to whether we're going to allow fracking, and there's still some talk of new oil exploration. The UK was the first country, I think, to commit to a net zero by 2050. And yet, when you look at our actions, when a crisis comes along, such as the Ukraine crisis, what do? We don't follow through. Well, if a country like the UK that has grown rich burning our fossil fuels and has grown rich from other people's countries as well, if our country can't stick to what is a relatively simple, sensible approaches, which will actually benefit low-income people, but the climate deniers will have you believe it's going to harm low-income people. Low-income people will benefit from the sensible things we could do in the UK, such as investing in onshore wind. So the short answer is maybe. The long answer is let's wait and see and keep pushing for the right thing.
And just to put it in perspective, the amount of offshore wind, let's say, in the UK far exceeds what we have here in the United States. To this day, we have one 5-turbine offshore wind farm that exists just off the coast of New England, and it provides basically power, not even all the power, for a small island called Block Island.
But can I have to say a thing there, because
we're on a path,
when you compare offshore wind in the UK or it's offshore because it's sitting in water, but we need very different technologies to do this here in the US, because we're not as blessed as UK is or Denmark is, where it's not really very deep. So you can use current technology, what you do onshore, and bring it offshore, which is why you're seeing a much faster development of offshore in the UK or in Denmark, where we need a different technology because our seafloor drops much rapid. It's just a little side note.
I think something like 2/3 of all of the offshore wind capacity is in deeper waters. And I just wrote a front page story for the Globe a month or two ago about these efforts to build floating offshore wind turbines, which offer incredible promise for generating pretty much all the power we might need in New England if we can actually, deploy them and permit them. And
so, but look, there's another. And again, I don't want to talk too much technology there, but look, I think for us in the US, it's not onshore, offshore. So we have a lot of wind capacity and a lot of land on our land mass. And if you just look at the Midwest, but then if you build this out, we would need to build more transmission lines to bring the energy to the coast, which a lot of people don't want.
Right. Okay, the big news, as most of you know, at a COP27 was the agreement to establish a so-called loss and damage fund to help poorer, more vulnerable nations cope with the impacts of climate change. But the problem with that agreement was that there were very few details that support the agreement in terms of how the money will actually come in and how it might ultimately reach the people who need it. So my question is, do you see this agreement as meaningful or lip service? Why or why not? And how might it be a meaningful tool ultimately to foster climate justice and improve our responses to climate disasters? And Roberto, I'll start with you.
Well, definitely. I mean, anything that moves into that direction and particularly focus on climate justice is very welcome. But as you said, we need to wait and see the details to really make an assessment, to really assess is this really a significant contribution. I mean, pledges done in the COPs are often not met or not fully met by countries. And that's part of the problem that we can face it with the loss and damages. A second point is that it definitely is a positive contribution, but it's a late contribution. I mean, this should have been done years ago. We have 3 decades of international negotiations, and climate justice just begins to become a reality, even with all the uncertainty of what is going to be implied. And an additional concern is that having one more fund without really funding or details, concrete details of how it's going to be funded, might also have unwanted consequences, like, for instance, competing with other funds, like the adaptation fund, for instance, or funds to mitigate. So in a context where There is a deep lack of funding to support climate action, particularly in the developing world. And having one additional fund without the concrete details of how it's going to operate makes me a little bit anxious and worried that it not fulfilled its full goals and intentions, and instead could turn to be a detrimental step if not adequate action and provisions are taken in advance to avoid that competition for funds to other important climate actions.
Thank you. Liz?
So I would probably say, as an economist, necessary but insufficient. So on the one hand, it's really important. I think it's really important it came out of what was called the Africa COP. So it sends a very important message that at last the voices of the low and middle income countries are being properly heard. Because in COP, there's always been very powerful voices. And I've been lucky enough to attend COP with the Burkina Faso delegation. So I've been actually listening to the G77 plus China voices. But this is the first year that there's been an acknowledgement. I think, as Roberto said, it's a difficult situation. On the one hand, high-income countries will not accept loss and damage if it's considered compensation, because this is a very touchy area. But on the other hand, it starts to really make us think about to what extent we can attribute the impacts of climate change to the large polluters. And so it starts to bring in the opportunities for litigation, and it starts to bring in opportunities to think about these issues of equity. So I would just say it's important, but at the moment it's more symbolic. There's very little money being put towards it, but it does change the dialogue of how we talk about climate change.
Martin?
Yeah, I think I would agree with both of you that my sense is, as again from the technology perspective, we need, it was good that this discussion is coming up, but I just hope that this will really lead to the action that we then can use this to do something. And that's honestly what I'm waiting for.
Okay. Constance?
Me, I think it's not good because it's like they've just thrown in a ball in the middle and no one is kicking, no one is touching, no one is doing that, because they've just stopped, they are giving the money. And giving the money, they've been call it what? They have been dollars. What dollars? What? Then today, they've already done what? They've already again talked and they don't fulfill. So that one is an empty promise, I call it, because when it's a promise and well stated and put everything in written, sign, put it in order, lay down properly, there you may see that things are fine. But now, just to talk and just to agree, I may not, because ever since they've been promising, I don't see any money coming down to the communities. We are struggling by ourselves to live without anybody, but they have the money. They don't want to give the money. They promise, and they, instead of decreasing the emission, they increase the emission. So at this hand, they want to give you, at this hand, they are increasing. So it's still a problem, according to me.
Thank you. Years ago, many wealthy countries pledged to pay $100 billion a year to effectively do something similar as the Loss and Damage Fund to help the most vulnerable countries in the global South. Unfortunately, most of those countries have yet to live up to that commitment. My question for the panel is that amount of money sufficient to make a real difference? And if you had the ability to choose how to spend that money, what would you do to make it most effective to benefit the most vulnerable? And Martin, I'll start with you.
Well, look, when you talk about is the money sufficient, my first argument is, well, I wish we would have the first tranche of money actually doing something. And again, because look, it's always coming back what I said, we're doing a lot of promises, but at the end is what are you doing to start implementing and get something going? And that's, I think, what I was hoping that with this activity, seeing from what we talk about in Europe, in the UK, what we're doing here in the US, can we really help this and use this money, assuming it will come, to really start implementing things and bringing the help to some of these communities. And again, it's coming back what I said earlier, I think, in my opinion, and I think we've heard this from the other panelists as well, that the way, in my view, to make this change is by working with the communities at different levels to get something going. And you brought up there what in Africa, you're right, there's a lot of communities, or same let's say, go even to some cities in India where there's no electricity at all. But what can we do that we prevent that they're making the same mistakes we have done? Technology is moving so fast that, well, do you have to put copper wires across the whole country? Or do you do this in a much more distributed way? So there's a lot of new technology available. And I always compare this, that bringing electricity to some of these communities is the same like what we've seen. You remember when we all had phones at our homes, and then we jumped and had cell phones. And a lot of these communities luckily never built out the copper wires in the countries. They went just directly to the cell phone technology. So now what do we need to bring to these communities to bring them their right, in my opinion, to have electricity and energy, but do it in a way which is the next form of technology. I think this is what we as communities could help these communities to do it in a different way. But it's easy, politicians talk a lot, but then what is the funds, what is the support structure we're building to help these communities? And that's frankly what I'm waiting for.
Constance?
Yeah, that money, I say that money is never enough. However much you have, it will not be enough unless you start on something. You begin doing something. But when you have the money, you plan and don't act, that's where you have no money. Let me say, we have no money because people are on the ground trying to do their own things, but the money is somewhere. The money is not being used on them. And me, I would say money is never enough. And I would say that let them start using however little the money is there, however little the money is not there, let them start on something. We build, okay, they will now come and build on what we already have, because we are already acting, we are already moving, but we are moving slowly. But when they come, they will now push us with the little money that they have, continuous up to where we can reach and save the world. But now when we sit, talk, there is money, and yet we don't see the money, we shall not realize any positive response at all.
Roberto.
Well, this is an important question, and I believe we should start by the basics. The climate finance is a subset of development aid that has been on stage for decades, and unfortunately with very poor results. The basic point here is that we need to update our financial development aid and climate finance structurally. Currently, just looking into the needs for only adaptation, for instance, this is data from the United Nations Environmental Program. They consider that currently between $140 to $3 billion per year will be needed by 2030 to meet only adaptation needs. This goes beyond the $100 billion per year that is supposed to be in place next year if everything goes well. And if we consider the scenario for 2050, I mean, the needs of adaptation funding would be $280 to $500 billion per year. So clearly this is not enough. If we consider also mitigation needs for climate funding, these figures increases quite significantly. Now, the problem is that the system doesn't really work that well. I mean, part of the problem is that and part of the criticism to the funding system is that funding often meets the priorities of the donor rather than the interests of the recipients. And there are a number of other criticisms, including that using adaptation aid to promote their economic interests or developing aid impose top-down solutions by donors that has little to do with the meaningful full participation in the recipient countries. So there are structural problems that need to be addressed. It's not only the $100 billion, it's really refining or updating the whole system to make a difference according to the current needs. And in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation, there are other problems. For instance, the national appropriate mitigation actions, some authors consider this an obstacle to fostering transformational changes in developing countries. They criticize the rigidity, the overemphasis on bureaucratic process, difficulties in setting appropriate indicators and timelines, specifying clear goals and responsibilities, and manages different priorities on a number of stakeholders and beneficiaries. So we clearly need to if we want to make a difference in terms of climate funding, structural changes need to be done to really accomplish what is intended.
And we'll come to that in a little bit more detail soon. Liz?
So if we think about 100 billion, we need to invest trillions each year to achieve resilient net zero societies. So on the one hand, it's a drop in the ocean. But I guess if we want to try and think about practical approaches, one aspect is to use this money to crowd in private investment. And so I'm going to use the example of Burkina Faso again, because that was the delegation I was talking with a lot in COP. And I was sort of saying to them, you're a Sahelian country, you're landlocked, you're by the Sahara, so, importing anything is costly, whether it's energy or food. And I was like, where's the solar power? And admittedly, there are quite a few investments now in it. My colleague said it's fine for you in the UK to invest in solar power. Your cost of capital is 1%, 2%, 3%. Here in Burkina Faso, because of the risk, it's 10%, 20%. And so de-risking the capital is quite important. So you can use some of that 100 billion to de-risk the cost of capital, which should crowd in private investment into a clean energy transition and clean energy growth for low-income countries. There's one other example I want to give that's quite an interesting way of investing in low and middle-income countries, and some of this 100 billion could be used in this way, and it's an example from the Seychelles. And in the Seychelles, Nature Conservancy bought some of the Seychelles debt, and we heard either yesterday or the day before that, and I think it's the example we've just given about being given with one hand and taking away with another. Whatever money countries are given towards climate change in one hand, they're generally low-income countries are paying more out in debt servicing. So Nature Conservancy purchased some of the debt, and in exchange, so there is conditionality with this, which of course is controversial in itself. But the conditionality was that the Seychelles, with the payments they would have made towards the debt, would be made towards the blue economy. And this is important for two reasons, because it contributes to mitigation, maybe three. It contributes to mitigation, it contributes to adaptation, and it contributes, importantly, to economic growth for the country. And so the blue economy for the Seychelles is tourism and fishing, which is really important. And so, they can invest in blue carbon and sequestration in that way, protecting their fisheries so they get a better economic benefit, protecting their coastal areas to encourage more tourism. And so I think these are some of the areas where we need to start to think creatively, how we bring private sector, public sector, and countries' priorities together to leverage what is really a very small amount of money, and realistically, However much we want rich countries to give more, it's getting really hard to get rich countries to give more. And, you know, post-COVID and post the invasion of Ukraine, countries are being even more reluctant. You know, the UK, a few years ago, we actually reduced the amount of aid we gave. We used to give 0.7% of GDP, and now we give 0.5% with the argument of we're poor. Actually, we've got a very highly unequal society, and we heard that earlier today as well. It's very hard to tackle climate change globally when you have inequality either within rich countries or across the planet. So we are a little constrained, which is why we have to be really smart with how we use any funding that we have. So we've got to have transparency. We've got to have local populations, as we've heard, engaged and involved in making those decisions. And we've got to have really good data, not just to know that we're doing better, but that we're doing the best we can with limited amounts of funding.
In the same vein, there have been growing calls to fundamentally overhaul the global financial system so that institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF might be able to do more to mobilize private capital as well as to reduce onerous interest rates. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, has built a growing movement among the most vulnerable nations to press for a range of reforms. What do you think are some of the most essential reforms needed in these particular institutions that might make a real difference? And is there anything you think Prime Minister Mottley's Bridgetown initiative is missing or perhaps getting wrong? And Roberto, I'll start with you on that one.
That's a tough question. I believe that one part of the problem is that we operate with institutions created in the 20th century and try to address problems in the 21st century. So lack of a data of those institutions really create more obstacles than solutions. And that's part of the problem with the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, fortunately, there is this call, and climate change has brought this new opportunity to try to operate these institutions. Now, from my perspective, what is missing in that proposal is combining the funding that is expected to reach developing countries with an emphasis of overcoming development gaps in those countries, not only in terms of mitigation, but particularly in terms of reducing vulnerability and adaptation. We need increasing knowledge. We need that these countries have the opportunity to strengthen their institutions. We can provide funds to many of these countries, but without the proper institutions to oversee an efficient use of those funds, then they're not going to make the difference that is expected. So there are a number of steps that need to be incorporated in the initiative to really accomplish the goals this intended.
Liz?
I touched on it a little bit, I think, in terms of, you know, sort of de-risking investments. But I think it's quite frustrating because if we think about the World Bank, the IMF, the multinationals, the development banks, they've become very conservative and very risk-averse. Maybe they always were. And actually, they should be the complete opposite. Because we need people to take the risks. And in general, the private sector's not going to. If it can find a less risky investment in a high-income country, it's not going to invest in a low-income country. So we need them to do what I think, in a way, they were supposed to do, which is, you know, act maybe a little bit more like venture capitalists, you know, who will take on the risk and accept that, you know, sometimes they'll back a winner and sometimes they won't. But it's the governments and the multinational banks that can actually afford to do that. So I think de-risking, as I said, investments is just one of those really important points. They need to take the risk so that they can reduce the risk for the private sector. So when the private sector is choosing where to invest, they're more likely to invest in a low-income country that needs the investment far more. And actually, there's potential for very high returns for the private sector because there's so much to be done in terms of energy transitions, in terms of investing in energy. There's a lot of inefficiencies in how energy is used, for example, in low-income countries. So there's tremendous potential, but because the risk profile is wrong, you know, we're just not getting the benefits we could. And I think if we think about where we are now, you know, the science, we all accept the science of climate change, so that's been sorted. And the economists like myself came along and we developed the environmental policy instruments that are needed to internalize the externalities. And then we have the technologies, and we also have the pathways to net zero. And arguably, the missing part of the puzzle is how do you finance the just transition? And that's really what we're working on right now. So I don't think we have all the answers, but it's absolutely central to that last piece of the jigsaw puzzle, I think. And it's still difficult, and it's still tricky, but it's where I think we need to focus a lot of our attention.
Martin?
Well, again, I'm not a banker, not a finance person. But I tell you what we are seeing by working with the world banks and by some of the development banks is that I would say many of the projects are what I would call one-offs. So they want to do this in a city, they want to do this project here. And I think in our view, what is missing is that what is the integrated plan for the larger country, for example, which then is, as you know, when you do the energy transition, you need to have the integrated plan to really transition this, and it's not enough to do one or two of these projects. It has to be integrated in the overarching strategy where the country goes. And then the other thing, what we see is that it's not enough just to build some of these projects. You're right, some of this is a problem, so how do we do the financing? But I think it's also important that, number one, you get the buy-in from these communities to do this. And number two is you do the capacity building, that you just don't, let's say, put a solar farm into a community and then a piece breaks and nobody knows how actually to fix it, or also how do you run with this intermittent resources. So we need not only build this project, but we need to also build the support system, the capacity building in these communities that they actually can fully embrace this and then also then know how to run with it.
Constance?
Yes, here it's like they fear the risks. They fear risking, putting in their money in helping people, the suffering people. But if they don't risk, they will not put in the money. They should try and risk and see and do the follow-up and go to the community. Do what the community wants. Look at this, because from bottom up, not from up to bottom, because the community themselves, they know what they want. They know what they are doing. They know what if I do this, it will change to this. But now if you don't risk and put money into them, things won't be. We won't go and reach where we are going, because without risks, I don't think we shall do anything, because the community will still continue suffering because we are still fearing the risks. Now the community are suffering, carrying on with their small activities to try and change the world. But you have the input, you don't want to give them. So there's going to still be, how can I call it? You go one step ahead, 2 steps backwards when the floods come. Again, you try 2 steps ahead, 3 steps backwards. That is when the long drought comes. You go some steps ahead, the other during the harsh weather. So you have to put in and go into it, say, let me risk and see the outcome. If the outcome does not come, then you change the strategy of doing what? Of doing things. So you just don't sit and say, I fear. Sit and do something instead of doing nothing and talking.
So I think this will be our last question. And as the moderator, I will take the liberty to ask a somewhat self-interested question. I'm wondering I think that the media, as well as universities, have a vital role to play in covering climate change, in addressing the inadequacies of our public policies, and in finding and charting solutions. And I'm wondering what each of you think that we should be doing better or what we're not doing to better cover or cast a spotlight on climate change, both in the media and in academia? And Martin, I think I'll start with you on that.
That's also a loaded question, I tell you. So because I tell you that what I would argue is one of the big issues, what I think we as scientists are also a little bit guilty on this one, honestly, is that climate change got too much politicized. That we're pulling this into, well, we call it here in the US, between blue and red. And I think it's the same. Look, I think in Europe the discussion is different. But also, honestly, when I go to our European colleagues, especially with the Ukraine war, suddenly I see that energy has get a very different dimension because of the increasing cost. And so my worry is that even there's a fear, in my view, that even there in the UK, energy might get politicized as well. So now coming back to the media, I think the key is sometimes, and again also we as scientists perhaps, we highlighted the issue but not necessarily showed the communities what some of the solutions can be. And then we talked in a way which a lot of folks really just did not understand. So I'll give you this example. When I was living in Tennessee for 10 years, we had a little farm and all our neighbors, well, did not really believe in climate change, but they said something is going on because every year I need to put larger gravel on my driveway because it's washed out. I'm like, what is it? It's climate change, because we had much stronger rainstorms. So, but look, we have not done a good way to really, at least I can only talk for the US, to really communicate what the real problem is. And then also, I'll give you another example. When you go to some of these communities where we know that solar with storage distributed system will give them much more energy security, where they're not in rural America get cut off at the end of the lines. With this technology we can do this right now. But a lot of these people don't accept this because they think, oh, this is just hippie technology to put some solar panels on my roof. How we communicated this in a wrong way, that we said, well, solar is saving the planet. Well, solar will help you that you're not losing power when there is an outage. Because this is a communication thing, and I think coming back where we need to do a better job, which is hard because people are just reading headlines these days, frankly. Twitter and Facebook does not help. But how do we bring a kind of the message to everybody that this is not a red or blue or yellow or green? No, it is really the best thing to do for the communities.
Right. This is an aside. I wonder, now that Elon Musk has come out as a right-winger, whether that actually helps and pushes the pendulum, because maybe electric cars won't be viewed as a lefty sort of thing if a now avowed right-winger is supporting them. Anyway, you don't have to answer that.
No, I tell you the problem is much deeper than this, because look, just yesterday I had a discussion with one of our neighbors who completely ignores electric cars. And then the arguments that folks bring up is coming from one very specific news channel. And how do you support and change these people if they only look and watch one news outlet? This is the problem you in the media will face.
Constance?
Yeah, when we talk about academia, that one is like, that one is right, because when it comes there, it comes with the indigenous knowledge, because the knowledge is already there for them. They have just added more through that education. But it is also good because when it comes to science, the science of the indigenous knowledge with the indigenous people are almost the same with the science going to school. When people go to school, bring the knowledge together, you'll find that things are working, and more, you find that the indigenous knowledge that people have is more than the science that the educated ones have. Then we talk about the media. Media is just to show. showing people that maybe reading through lines, whereby for us, we don't have time to read through lines. We don't have time to look at those medias. We don't have time to listen to the news because we need our time for the garden. We need our time for our homes. We need our time to keep our children because climate change has doubled the workload that we had, and now it has taken, because if you delay and miss the time, that is when you are off. If you delay, you miss the season, you are completely off. If you delay, when you don't do things in time, you are completely off. So we don't have the time for those media issues, those reading. Maybe they will come and say that, yeah, it is like yesterday we had a meeting and how many people died? Did you see? But it's just a talk. But we need action on the ground with the academia and the indigenous knowledge together, and we shall find that everything will be fine.
I hope you're right. Roberto.
Okay, let me begin with media, and I have a lot of respect for the role of media in addressing critical challenges for societies, and climate change is just one of them. There are several others, like the threat of democracy and a number of other problems that societies throughout the world are facing right now. But I think the media can play an important role giving voice and presence to the marginalized and the vulnerable communities. Part of that, and this is critical to really enhance the visibility and representation that these communities deserve to have in addressing these kind of challenges. The other point that media can help enormously and has already done to some extent is in terms of accountability, bringing accountable not only governments, but also the corporations and a number of other important players in the climate crisis that we've currently face. And accountability could be a very powerful tool to really make a difference in the way we address this problem. And the third point that the media can help is, and this was addressed also by President Robinson yesterday, the third point that the media can help is to communicate the kind of future that we are constructing through the climate crisis, to really help us bring the message of what is embedded in the climate crisis for societies around the world, and what is the role of different players in that crisis. So I think those are three important points that media can help us. In terms of the academia and being part of that group, I feel a little bit responsible. I think one of the big challenges in academia is really coordinating the generation of knowledge. And IPCC is a good example. It takes IPCC 4 years and thousands of voluntary work to really come and create those assessments of what has the scientific community contributing in terms of what do we know in terms of climate change. That's a huge effort and it takes a lot of time. And what we need now is really to have available useful knowledge as soon as possible to address many of the critical issues that we are currently discussing. And so I think academia can do a much better job coordinating efforts and focusing in critical points that need to be addressed to make a difference in terms of the climate crisis. Part of that is one of the big challenges. The other big challenge for academia is really reaching out to society and decision makers. And when I talk about decision makers, it's not only public officials, it's also other actors in society. It could be NGOs, it could be civil groups, it could be business groups, etc. All of those people are making decisions on a daily basis that affect our future. And I think we haven't done a good job in reaching our society in terms of bringing knowledge that is useful for that decision-making process. Part of that has to do with the pressures academia is subject to. I mean, we need to publish, we need to participate in a number of other activities. We are responsible for creating future professionals that are functionally in a different context that we grew up. And it's not easy, but at the same time, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that we could do much better than job that we have done so far.
Liz, you have the final word.
I think media, academics, we're definitely losing the propaganda war, and it's really frustrating. I think in the past we just sort of thought that if we sort of told the truth and just provided facts, that would be okay. But as climate deniers have worked harder to now no longer deny climate change perhaps, but now talk about why we have to delay, I do think we have an obligation to work much harder. And I'll give a quick Brexit analogy, because I'm British, so I'm going to take that liberty. And it doesn't matter which side of the debate you're on. The people who wanted to leave Europe painted a picture of a very rosy future, the milk and honey on the hills. And the people who wanted to stay in Europe just told of doom and gloom if we didn't stay in. And it was sort of called Project Fear, and it didn't work. And I think if we're not careful, we're losing that battle again in climate change. And, you know, I'm not the first to say this. Many people have said this in this conference. But we need to start talking about investing in a more exciting future, because that's what mitigating climate change means. It means a healthier future for our children. It means getting rid of air pollution. It means, by definition, a more equitable society, because we'll have to invest in public transport. It'll mean healthier lifestyles, because we'll invest in more balanced diets, and we'll invest in active transport, so encouraging people to walk and cycle because it's safe to do so, and you can get from A to B quickly. I think the other thing, just briefly, is that we need to craft better narratives around the data. We're not very good at crafting those narratives. And we have to, somehow, the climate change deniers have made people in rich countries believe that tackling climate change is going to harm the poor, when actually it's the complete opposite. Tackling climate change will benefit the poor in high-income countries, will benefit them in the low-income countries. And we have the data to prove that. But again, we just haven't won the communications. And so I think we have a responsibility, I think any academics working in the sphere of climate change, to be more than academics. We don't necessarily have to glue ourselves to paintings, though it seems to be quite effective to get people talking. But I think we have a certain responsibility to do more than produce research and to do more than publish, but to figure out how we can communicate, because we've run out of time not to be activists in some way and do better.
I have to say that I think I've always been mystified why the narrative around particle pollution hasn't been a greater thrust of our approach. David Wallace Wells, who was on the stage yesterday, who wrote a wonderful book called The Uninhabitable Planet, noted that I think an estimated 10 million people die every year as a result of pollution. And if we can get all of those cars off the road and switch them out with EVs, forget the emissions benefit in terms of climate change or temperature of the planet. It will have an immediate impact on people's lives in terms of reduced pollution. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Martin Keller. Thank you, Constance Okolet. Thank you, Liz Robinson. And thank you, Roberto Sanchez Rodriguez. We really appreciate it. Please give him a round of applause. Thank you.